Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Dick, and on behalf of my fellow co-founders, Scott Silverman and Veronica Sonsev, as well as the entire rest of the CommerceNext team, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today is Wednesday, July 17th, 2024, and our topic this week is Exclusive Insights, revealing retailer strategies for holiday 2024 Q4 success. Before we go any further, I'd like to welcome and thank today's speakers. Sucharita Kodali, she's the VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Kamanasish Kundu, he's the VP and Head of Digital and E-Commerce at Kendra. Scott Kramer, the VP of Growth Marketing at AS Beauty, and Jay Topper, Chief Customer Officer at Fabric. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you as well to Fabric for sponsoring today's broadcast. We couldn't bring these webinars to the community without the support of our sponsor partners. I also want to thank all of the CommerceNext staff that are behind the scenes. That's Maeve, Robert, Scott, and Veronica, who are all helping to make this webinar a success. But most of all, I want to thank you, the audience, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's quickly move through some housekeeping and upcoming events news. Our next webinar takes place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, July 31st. The topic, Innovative Strategies to Thrive in the New AI-Powered E-Commerce Landscape. Veronica Sonsev will take the helm on that session. She'll be speaking with Suruchi Shukla, the VP of Marketing at Minted, Ryan Williams, the VP of Digital at Full Beauty Brands, Kelly Ghosh, the Chief Strategy Officer at Commerce Tools, and John Pinella, the Group Vice President at Publicis Sapient. You can register at that webinar by clicking on the link in the chat. Is it ever too early to register for the CommerceNext Growth Summit? Of course not. Do you like standing in line and on-site registration at the CommerceNext Growth Summit? Of course not. Well, you can take care of both of these issues at the same time by registering now, snagging the limited time benefit of Fast Pass registration. Learn more about our 2025 Growth Show by clicking on the link in the chat. Moving along, I want to remind you that our YouTube channel now has over 400 videos. I actually think it's around 425 now, with covering topics including acquisition, retention, leadership, retail technology, and so much more. It's a great resource. Learn more about our YouTube channel by visiting the link in the chat. Of course, we are recording this webinar, and we'll email it to you when we publish it later this evening. Let me take a moment to remind everyone where to find the things you need to get the most out of this webinar. There are count them, four tabs in the upper right hand of your screen. Those are Chat, Q&A, Polls, and Handouts. Please use the Chat tab when you want to communicate with the other attendees or offer a shout out to the speakers. Use the Poll tabs. This is where you're going to participate in the audience polls. You can review the final results after we close the polling. Handouts tab is where we have today's presentation and other useful information available for you to download. But really, the most powerful tool at your disposal on this webinar is the Q&A tab. This is your steering wheel, allowing you to drive the conversation by posing the questions directly to our speakers. To further encourage you to ask questions, our good friend Ryan Monahan, the CMO at Redcon1, is once again generously providing a full box of their MRE protein bars with free shipping to any location in the US to every audience member whose question we select for the panel discussion. Now, take it from me, they are extra yummalicious. I love these things. I'll send the qualifying audience members a promo code for their free box after the webinar ends. Now remember, even if you don't have a specific question, you can still participate by upvoting the other audience questions. Now, this really helps us prioritize which questions to present to the panel by letting us know which ones you think are the most important. Lastly, if you're watching this on the replay, please note that the handouts are available by clicking on the highlighted document icon in the video player, and the audience poll question results are available via the Polls tab. With that, let's start things off by welcoming the one and only Sucharita Kodali. She's a VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Sucharita, welcome aboard again. You know, it's funny. It's like as I was going through those slides, all of them have you on it. As I was going through those examples of where to find things, like, oh, Sucharita's there, Sucharita's there. You've been on a couple of these with us, haven't you?
Well, always a pleasure, Alan, and it's an honor. It's always, I always appreciate the opportunity to share the research, and CommerceNext is always a wonderful community that always asks great questions and listens, and hopefully you guys will all stay on through the course of this webinar. So awesome.
All right, Sucharita, we'll let you take it away.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for being here. And when Alan first asked if I would do this, I was like, well, I actually don't have a lot of stuff on a holiday yet. It's a little early, but the CommerceNext team generously offered to field a survey about it. We had the last time we did a survey actually was in 2022, or actually 2021. That we basically just kind of did a redux of. So I'll share with you a little bit of the comparison of where we are now versus where we were just even a few years ago, because I think that it's so interesting how different things are. It's almost as if in some ways the pandemic never happened. It was like this alternative kind of reality where we've almost gone back to kind of essentially what happened in 2019. But I'll share that with you as we go through this. So a little bit of background: we did field a study, a survey over the last few weeks. It was right after the CommerceNext Summit in New York, and thank you all who did respond to this, because whenever we're able to get primary source data from you all, it is so valuable and it is incredibly useful to understanding what's happening in the industry. So at a high level, you have the type of merchants who responded and the annual revenue. We think it's a pretty good mix of brand manufacturers, retailers, pure play digital commerce companies. We have a variety of different revenue points, several over $1 billion and some that are small as well. In general, I would say that merchants are pretty optimistic about the upcoming holiday season. And the number is that I'm looking at here is the delta between the 25% and the 43%. About 25% expect that this holiday season is going to be worse than last holiday season. But 43% think that it's going to be better. So if we were to extrapolate that to the industry, e-commerce should be doing well. Now, all that said, there are always going to be winners and losers in any economic environment. And what I'll often hear from companies is an issue like, oh my goodness, kind of I'm not doing well, and therefore the industry must be doing badly. And often there's a sense of wanting to justify one's performance with, oh, it's a macroeconomic issue, and that kind of is the reason for doing poorly. And if the more misery loves company. So if everybody's doing badly, then it's a lot easier to kind of talk to your CEO and kind of justify the numbers. But the reality is that, as you saw from the previous slide, the numbers for a lot of e-commerce companies are actually pretty strong, and you can see that here, where and this is actually the e-commerce divisions of these players that actually they're publicly traded companies, and they're the ones that actually break out the e-commerce growth numbers. It's across the board, right? I mean, so you have the companies that are in the mass space, like a Walmart or a Costco, doing very well. Of course, Amazon doing well too. But then you have other players in the department stores and big box like Best Buy that are not doing as well. And I just frame that because there are a lot of different players in the 25% that are challenged, and there are a variety of different players in the 43% that are doing well. I mean, even within the apparel sector, you're going to have players like an American Eagle Outfitters, which has been doing pretty well over the last year, and Lululemon, and you contrast that with a company like a Nike, which may have been doing very, very well over the last few years, but is a little bit more challenged at the moment. What I will also step back and say is that globally, the economy is doing really well. And there are two data points that I want to point out. One is unemployment rates. So typically, you may recall, kind of over the years, it wasn't uncommon to see double-digit unemployment rates in regions like Latin America or Europe. And now, as you can see, in every major market in the world, unemployment is in the single digit percent. And even the places where it's like high, like France, it's not over double digits yet. So that's actually a good economic indicator. In the United States, we're actually at a record low of unemployment. And the other factor is GDP growth, which is positive. everywhere, every major market in the world. And remember, a recession is when there are consecutive quarters of negative growth. There is not a market here that is expected to have negative GDP growth for 2024. And this is IMF data that is there. So I think that both of these points really, kind of shout out how well the economy globally is doing at this moment in time. And then when we break out retail by the various subcategories within retail, in the same way that there are some companies that are going to be doing much better than others, not just through the course of the year, but certainly in Q4, when we're looking year to date, how our company is doing. We have certain sectors that are in that growth level. We have e-commerce, of course, overall. But even outside of e-commerce, you have the restaurant sector continuing to do well. You have clothing, apparel, accessories, and footwear, for the most part, picking up some of the share loss and against some of the challenges that they had over the last few years. And the companies overall, those types of retailers that are more challenged on the bottom of this chart, are highly correlated to some of those interest rate numbers. So it is the furniture stores and the home improvement stores, in large part because people are not buying their homes because the interest rates are still higher than what the consumer would like. So that's where you have some of those big ticket purchases being challenged. And of course, department stores has been a leitmotif of challenge for several years now. When we asked retailers what they expect very specifically for the amount of promotional volume for this coming holiday season, particularly on those key dates, we expect net more promotional volume on Black Friday and Thanksgiving. The Cyber Week, it looks like it'll moderate somewhat, and it'll be more of a comp to last year. And then December, interestingly, even in spite of it being a relatively short holiday season, that too, at this moment in time, is not expected to be a heavier promotional timeframe. Now, as you all know, kind of holiday promotions are often very flexible and fluid, because depending on how your numbers may turn out in November, you may turn on another shipping promotion, or you may decide to add, kind of some sort of a BOGO offer, or additional products on sale in December, because that's where, that's the point at which you'll be able to make that change. When we asked retailers what type of shipping promotions, or we actually asked them, kind of a number of questions around, kind of how they were thinking of promoting, it, kind of was across the kind of the spectrum of things that they were considering. So in the yellow is, again, the net number of new shipping promotions. So you have only 6% of the merchants that responded to our survey saying that they were promoting fewer, they were having fewer shipping promotions, and 22% saying that they were adding more shipping promotions. Now, what kinds of shipping promotions? It was everything from, kind of more days of free shipping. It could be lower thresholds on free shipping, more products covered by free shipping. What I did think was interesting is that there are more retailers that are increasing that threshold of free shipping versus lowering that threshold. And that, I think, also ties to some of the margin challenges that retailers may be facing themselves, particularly if they're in a hyper-competitive retail environment, and inflation has meant that they haven't been able to basically pass on all of those inflation supply chain costs to the shopper. And your ability to also offer free shipping offers on top of that may be a little too rich for a lot of retailers. That may be why you're seeing some of that increase in shipping threshold. This comes to the margin point, which is that on average, merchants are saying that their margins are probably more or less going to be the same as last year. You have 28% saying that margins will be, net positive, higher than in the last holiday season, and 30% actually saying that they would be lower. And that's likely part of the reason that the shipping is not going to be quite as generous for a number of retailers, particularly if they have threshold-based shipping offers. One of the biggest concerns that merchants said they expect for this holiday season is the consumer spending levels. And this is largely tied to just concerns, everything from consumer confidence being lower to just the fact that for a number of merchants, they may not be seeing the same lift. And there's a lot of uncertainty just in general around what happens through the back half of 2024, what happens with interest rates. Kind of there's this sense of even though unemployment is low right now, in 6 months, could things be vastly different? On the other hand, you have explicitly 39% of merchants saying that inflation's an issue. And interestingly, a number of these factors that were supply related in the past, which I'm going to show you in a moment, are barely registering on the charts now, like labor shortages in stores or labor shortages in fulfillment centers. Supply chain issues, definitely not. And less of an issue also is the late deliveries. Now we know that consumer sentiment is still down. So that's one of the things that's interesting is that even though these large economic indicators related to unemployment or GDP are still strong, what is down is the fact that consumers just don't feel as good about the economy. There's a sense of uncertainty and the fact and this possibility looming that things may change at any moment. And if you look at this is University of Michigan's data, where that consumer sentiment number is, there are only a few times over the course of the last few decades that the numbers have been as low as they are now. One is in the 2008, 2009 recession. And then the other was in like the 1980s, early 80s, late 70s, when oil prices were as high as they were. So it's just interesting to frame how low consumer sentiment is in spite of the fact that there are other kind of every other economic indicator is actually positive. One of the other things that we keep hearing about merchants that kind of that is a factor for a number of them this particular holiday season is that this is a short selling season. And just a little bit of a pop quiz here. Does anyone know, just kind of, you can answer amongst yourselves, why Thanksgiving is never on November 29th or 30th? And I'll explain that in a moment. But this holiday season is a particularly short season because Thanksgiving is falling on November 28th. FYI, the latest that Thanksgiving will ever fall in the United States is November 28th. The earliest it would fall is November 22nd, which gives an extra week of, kind of a cyber week or, kind of that holiday, that core holiday shopping season. But that time period between November and December 25th is now the shortest that it generally ever is. The reason that Thanksgiving is never those last 2 days is that actually when the second president, Roosevelt, FDR, was president, he was lobbied by the National Retail Dry Goods Association to actually create a longer holiday timeframe. And rather than Thanksgiving falling on the last Thursday in November, which could have made it November 29th or 30th, and which it had been in the past, they made it the fourth Thursday in November. So that is the reason that with the fourth Thursday in November will never fall on the 29th or 30th. So that's the reason that the 28th is the last day that you will ever have Thanksgiving. And that is the day of Thanksgiving this year. Now, what does that mean for e-commerce? And a large part of that is that when you have that shorter season, you generally also have retailers that are pretty fixed in their supply, their essentially their delivery system and their fulfillment infrastructure. And what we see here is that the majority of retailers are essentially having their shipping offers basically at either the 7 to 14 day mark or the more than 2 week mark. So the question here specifically is that when can consumers order from your site to essentially get standard delivery? And if kind of for a significant portion of people, it's like, kind of a week before Christmas, And that week is, kind of a very, very short time frame after Thanksgiving. Then the question becomes, will consumers just, kind of not plan early enough, and they'll end up shopping much later, and they'll end up going to stores potentially. So that's an important consideration, is that we haven't seen the retailer decide to push that last shipping date closer and closer to December as a result of this season. And of course, that's an incredibly expensive thing to do. Many of you have already been asked by your carriers what your commitments are for the holiday season. And from a package standpoint and the ability to flex into and increase that number, it's not really that, kind of possible, kind of late in the season. So that naturally affects your margins, because if you do want to get things to people at a certain amount, they are going to have to pay for expedited shipping. And that becomes the question is, what percent of consumers actually will pay for expedited shipping during the holidays versus just going to the stores or, purchasing whatever is available to them locally. We also see that on average, the amount of time that retailers are planning for packages to get to consumers is often, it's not a standard 2-day delivery, kind of that competes with Amazon or Amazon Prime by any stretch of the imagination. You have about a third of retailers saying that they're expecting to get packages in more than 5 days, and another 20% probably aiming for that a 4-day time horizon. So just some things to keep in mind. Only 2% are doing things same day or next day. Now, just to compare again to even a few years ago during the, kind of more of that pandemic timeframe, that notion of consumer spending being a big factor this year is substantially different from when we last did the survey in 2021, because then consumer spending was one of the lowest concerns. And what was the biggest concern back then were the supply chain issues. And I think you may remember how, kind of how different that timing was, because the supply chain issues also meant that there was less inventory that retailers could promote. And, the consumer still had an appetite to spend quite a bit. They just didn't have things to spend on. So the notion of, the consumer being a factor was less, even just a few years ago. And now we, of course, have inflation, and we have, kind of a very, very hot economy, which is actually seemingly, kind of a backlash for a lot of spend at this moment in time. There are a couple of other things that we had asked questions about. One was return rates, and we returns, as you may see, is a question that we get a lot about, because it is such an expense, and there are always questions about, are there things that we can do as a retailer to reduce the return rate and improve our EBIT? And 80% of people said that they are not planning on making any changes to their return policies. And of the remaining 20% that are making changes, we weren't really able to get a great story out of it, because 10% are saying that they're going to have a stricter return policy, and another 10% are saying that they're going to have a more lenient return policy. So it sort of evens out to not really any major changes to return policies, at least in the coming months. It's more seemingly a lot of what I see from my vantage point at Forrester is that there's more investment in some back end technologies to try to make returns smarter, or to increase the salvage value of what comes back as a return, or to improve some of the product descriptions so that you can avert returns altogether. And it's less about, kind of making a return policy visible to consumers. In general, we know that a generous return policy is one of the single biggest drivers of conversion rates in e-commerce. So it doesn't actually surprise me that people aren't willing to make major changes to their return policy. It can be something that's a lever that both affects profitability, but also affects conversion as well. So just a few final thoughts on what happens next is we asked an open end, and this is one of my favorite parts of the survey, is just to hear what people are thinking, and what do they think is going to happen to the holiday season. So we heard everything from, stores win, bricks and mortar may come out ahead because people don't realize that there's such a short time frame between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Another comment was that customers will be very price conscious and shopping earlier or later to find deals because, in an inflation heavy environment, you just want deals. And often there's a lot of shopping for self. There's a lot of, kind of holding out for that toaster or whatever that you had your eye on, that you're just looking for what is that great deal. There is also a sense of the election looming. So we have a couple of comments that there's going to be a big lift in sales after the election. Post-election relief turns into renewed customer confidence, and we'll talk about the election shortly. And then another is, and I think this is largely due to that short selling season, is that the same day and BOPUS delivery methods are going to be much more used. People can't wait for their packages to be delivered to them. One last just kind of set of data points here is we asked, were there any kind of specific programs that merchants were doing to retain customers? And what we did see is a grab bag of different things. We're seeing partnerships with influencers, loyalty program investments, community engagement, charity initiatives. So just kind of a variety of different things that retailers are doing there. And if you do have any questions, my email is just first initial, last name at Forrester. Sorry, it's in blue, so a little bit hard to read here, but that is what I have for you.
All right, Sucharita, thank you so much. We're going to bring you back here after we do a couple of poll questions. Let us move forward. So, wow, questions are coming in. Really appreciate that. I'm looking at them coming in. There's a lot of good stuff in there. We are going to do our best to get into those. Please keep them coming in. This is what makes this fun. All right, let's get into some polls here. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions, see where your head's at. Question number 1, your opinion. When does a 2024 online holiday season start? When does a 2024 online holiday season start? Is it the first half of October, second half of October, first half of November, second half of November? It's going to take a couple of seconds here for this to come in, but read them again. When does the 2024 online holiday season start? Looks like first half of October is in the lead with roughly 39%, second half of October, 36%. First half of October is 22%. And I think that's it. So, interestingly enough, back in 2020, we asked everyone this, and it was the second half of October that won. So you can see that, perceptions are, it's starting earlier and earlier. This year it was the first half of October was the winner. 4 years ago, it was the second half of October. So it's interesting to see how those perceptions change. All right, next up, question number 2. Which digital marketing challenges concerns you the most for holiday 2024? Which digital marketing challenge concerns you the most for holiday 2024? Is it data privacy restrictions that are decreasing the ability to target? How about a crowded or competitive market? Unpredictable consumer behavior? How about increased media costs, higher CPCs, etc.? Or none of the above? It looks like unpredictable consumer behavior is coming in around 37%, crowded competitive markets at 34%, and it looks like it's sticking there. All right, let's wrap that one up. Unpredictable consumer behavior in the lead. Well, let's see what you said before. Back in 2021, on July 28th, it was pretty much the same, with unpredictable consumer behavior tying with crowded competitive market. And as Sucharita's research has shown, definitely unpredictable consumer behavior still on the top of everyone's mind. So you guys are in line with our survey results and with historic trends. So, all right. Our last question relates to our next webinar taking place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, July 31st. Veronica Sonsev is moderating, and the topic is Innovative Strategies to Thrive in the New AI-Powered E-Commerce Landscape. Veronica wants to know, which part of your e-commerce business has benefited most from AI? Which part of your e-commerce business has benefited most from AI? Is it customer service and chat? How about website copy with product descriptions? Search and navigation? What about site optimization and testing? Or personalization and product recommendations? Or maybe it's something else. If it is something else, feel free to toss it over in the chat. Love to see what you're thinking about this. Very nice. Looks like, yeah, personalization, product recommendations smoking at 40%. Followed right behind with website copy and product descriptions at 35. Search and navigation's around 8%. Customer service and chat is 15. And site optimization and testing and something else are 0 each. There you have it. That's where it's making the most amount of impact. All righty. Thank you very much, Scott, for getting those polls up there. And let's bring on our panel, shall we? Hey, everyone. How's everyone doing? I'll take silent grunting to start with. I'm a little more excited about this, but we're gonna warm up. We're gonna get this going here. All right, so let's make some introductions. We've already met Sucharita. KK, how would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. I head up the e-commerce and digital business at Kendra. We are a lifestyle brand founded in 2002, $1 billion valuation with more than 145 plus stores in the US. And philanthropy is a big pillar for Kendra, and we have donated over 65 million in the last decade. So very much looking forward to the discussion today and great insights, Sucharita.
All right, Scott, you're next up on the hit parade.
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. I'm Scott Kramer, VP of Growth at AS Beauty. We're a beauty and cosmetics holding company. We currently own and operate 5 brands in our portfolio, largest of which you guys may know of would be Laura Geller, followed by CoverFX, Julep Beauty, Bliss Skincare, and Mally Beauty. And I oversee all of our revenue growth opportunities, predominantly which kind of fall under the paid media side. Our biggest sales channel is typically e-commerce, so you can kind of see how we kind of have a little bit of back and forth between Jay and KK. But yeah, excited to talk through holiday and everything that we're seeing and planning for.
Outstanding. Mr. Topper.
Hi, it's also, I'll echo my peers here. It's great to be with everybody. I work as the Chief Customer Officer for Fabric. The last 27 years or so of my life, I was in retail, so in a lot of people's shoes that are on this call. Most recently, the Chief Digital Officer at Chico's FAS, and before that, I was the CDO at the FTD group of gifting companies. And since 30 days in, I'm now work for a composable headless software platform that I actually implemented at my last company and moved over to there about a month ago. So it's great to be here and great to sponsor this webinar too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And by the way, congratulations on the new position and title. Well done, you.
Thank you.
I do want to make a quick note here that Fabric graciously gave up their presentation time so Sucharita could go over these facts and figures with everyone. And so to that extent, I would urge everyone to go up into the handout section, take a look not only for Sucharita's slide deck, which is up there for your availability, but also there's a nice little piece of information about Fabric and what they do. And again, I thought it was very gracious of you to give that time over to Sucharita. I thought that was very informative and very nice of you and your company to do. All right. So let's do this. Let's start. I want to open this up because there's a whole bunch of places we can go here, but I want to open this up by discussing some comments from Sarah Wallace. She is the CMO over at Minted, and she made some comments about the holiday season in our last webinar. Rob, can you play that clip?
My biggest concern about holiday 2024 is that this is the year that we have the fewest number of days between Thanksgiving and Christmas that is possible.
Right.
So that compressed selling season plus an election creates a lot of uncertainty.
It sure does, and it's definitely a concern. Sucharita picked up on it. The polling picked up on it. Even one of our questions from Mark Friedman asked about those questions. So let me toss this out here. Let's just start by discussing the ramifications of the shorter selling season. KK, I'm going to let you take the first whack at this one.
Sure. So again, I think it's a like a really good question. So typically, like when you have a shorter selling season, so that means you're going to start seeing influx of orders like within a shorter window, because at the end of the day, like most brands will try to drive positive comp over their numbers last year, right? So then it's all about like how you can be more agile and proactive. And I think of this as more like a sprint, not a marathon. We need to play during that short window. So we need to double down on logistics, like inventory management, like early promotions. We were talking like pre-sale events, and help like spread the demand. And I think like we were talking about like how the omni programs like BOPIS will play a big part like towards the end in terms of the lead gifting. And then finally, I'll just mention again, I think we just need to embrace the data insights to optimize the execution as well as like predict the demand. I think those can be the potential game changers during this year.
All right, Scott, you had some thoughts on that when we chatted on the prep call.
Yeah, I think KK's provides a bunch of great points. So kind of like looking at your data and kind of comping year over year, especially knowing that there's going to be a little bit of a different year. So even kind of when you're doing your analysis, how was last November comping at this November? I think the big one that sometimes gets overlooked in these kind of weird times of years when this happens is that Cyber Monday is actually going to fall in December. So you can't be thinking, you know what, if I'm comping to a 50% year over year growth, let me apply that to my November, because one of your biggest days of November actually is not going to be in November. So I think a big thing we also like to look at is like how many days of promotional periods do we have in past years, and kind of like play with those adjustments. Like where are we doing it? I think a big thing Sucharita was kind of calling out was the shipping thresholds. If you know you have to really stop selling on your kind of promotions by a certain date, what do we need to do to kind of either make the most out of that shorter selling period or start your sales earlier? So kind of like if we know that we want to have at least 10 promotional days, where do those 10 days lie? Do we have to start our sale earlier? Do we have to kind of extend longer and maybe play with some more shipping thresholds? I think that's where people are saying they're going to try kind of opting for the later. I think another thing is, you know what, do we extend our sales? If we're not feeling that we're getting as much out of our promotion that we wanted, do we kind of push and add more days on at the back? And, you know, do we have to kind of play with some stuff on that shipping? I think is going to be interesting for all brands to kind of figure out on for themselves.
Yeah, both very good points. Jay, you had a thought on that, especially around starting early with the prep. Can you want to go into some detail on that? I think that's useful.
Yeah, sure. With a truncated selling season, I think starting early, and it starts with product. In most of the companies I've worked for and the ones we serve now, making sure your product buying and your allocation strategy is in place. It moves on into the temp labor in stores and DCs and call centers. If everything's truncated, you have less time to go through the training cycles and the hiring cycles. And then even your marketing channels, I think there's more and more lead time to warm up some of those algorithms and some of those marketing channels where you can start to get some very early learnings. So getting in sort of almost a war room environment a little bit earlier than normal so you can be really prepared to pivot quickly, I think is critical in a shortened selling season.
Yeah, and on top of this, we're in an election year, and a big election year. So the second question I want to ask you is that Sarah also mentioned the political environment here, and she's not alone. Mark Freeman, again, he mentioned it in the questions. Thank you, Mark, for your question. But I was also talking with Samantha McGee, the VP of Integrated Marketing over at Kathy Quo, and she wanted to ask you guys, quote, "I'm curious about predictions and how the election year will affect marketing costs, marketing saturation, and overall consumer demand ahead of Black Friday and Cyber Monday." Jay, do you want to start with that one, and we'll work back?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the days leading up to the election and the days after are going to be, somewhat unpredictable. To me, it comes down to your ability to make even intraday changes and being able to pivot, and getting some of those habits early before you lead up to there is critical, whether it's making changes to the site, your promotion strategy, your variable marketing costs. We can get in a habit of even changing that within the half day or the quarter day to make pivots around what the consumer behavior is doing during those periods of time. It's a little bit unpredictable. Can't control the macro, but you can control the micro. So I think fast speed and pivoting is critical.
Scott or KK? Now it's a toss-up. Who wants to take it?
I'll jump in on it. Yeah, I mean, I think
You raise your hand first.
it really is just like it's going to be an interesting year. There's a lot going on. I think it really follows this whole consumer kind of sentiment and their buying power that I think they're watching to see where the election sways. How does that affect them personally, financially? I think another component that we continue to watch is just advertising media costs. I think traditionally there's fears that the different parties are going to be spending a lot in advertising. Is that going to drive up costs? Is that going to affect spending? I was just talking with some of our larger social channels. They were saying that, you know what, while it is a fear, only about 1% of that spend is election. So as long as you're not kind of really going after and narrowing in on a swing state for some reason, you should be okay. But I think where it does play into some of the larger advertisers on the TV side, we've seen a lot of success with advertising on news channels. I think that's one that is definitely going to be driving up costs. So inventory is going to get tightened up, so costs are going to be squeezed. But again, there are going to be more people flocking to those. So there could be opportunities for these arbitrage moments of like, you know what, there's going to be higher costs, but way higher impressions. So there could be these kind of like fire sale deals to be had to really get in front of people. I think also if you have the data to look back how election years performed in past, I think it's always an interesting one where, you know what, maybe there isn't that much of actual buying that is happening on election day because people are preoccupied. They're watching the news, they're watching their phones, they're talking to people. But that is another opportunity where there's massive inventory influx for people that are spending time in these digital channels where you get a lot of eyeballs on your advertising. Maybe it's not going to have a payoff in the moment, but you know what? They're going to remember that brand a day after, 2 days after, even a week after. We've got all of our cyber sales that could be starting right after the election. So a lot of stuff to play with and kind of think about your marketing strategy and kind of sales forecasting.
Sounds good. KK, anything to add to that before we bounce on to the next one?
Yeah, again, I'll echo like everything like Jay and Scott mentioned. So only thing I'll just add, like, so one of the adjustment we had to do in our forecast days leading up to election, like we were a bit conservative, like in our forecast, but then our assumption that is that like after the election, things will normalize. And in terms of the marketing costs, again, I think it's always good to look for like what other alternatives like you have, which can kind of like nullify the impact you might be seeing in TV, etc. And the personalization is going to be key in those marketing activations.
So let's tie all this together. Rob, bring my deck back up. So here's one slide from Sucharita's deck that I want to examine a bit more. So the top retailer concern is that consumer spending levels are dropping. Now, on one hand, this seems like a perfectly rational concern, right? It's all over the media. Like one example I saw was U.S. News and World Report on June 14th was high prices keep consumer sentiment weak. However, there's a stat from the U.S. Department of Commerce, and Sucharita alluded to this, that this is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Department of Commerce, that I want to bring into the discussion. They're reporting that consumer disposable income as well as consumer spending keep rising month over month. This is a trend that's gone on for quarter over quarter, and yet people are still gloomy about the overall economy. So what's the reason? Well, on July 9th, Paul Krugman from the New York Times wrote an article called The Matrix of Consumer Discontent, in which he said, quote, widely cited expectations of negative economic perceptions are inconsistent with observations that go beyond just consumer sentiment. For instance, this goes to the political issues. A person's consumer sentiment seems to be highly influenced by their political beliefs. Here we see that consumer sentiment among independent voters, shown as the blue line, dropped as inflation became a problem in 21 and 22. However, Democrat and Republican voters completely switched their view of the economy relative to independents just after the 2020 presidential election. So for Krugman, the only hypothesis that seems to work with all this data involves, quote, the narratives people hear and see rather than their own experience. So basically the theory for the disconnect is what people say doesn't match their actions or their realities. And so the question I've got for the panel is, are retailers right to be worried about consumer spending this holiday season? Sucharita, I'm going to start with you because I know you've got something to say about this.
Yeah, so we had the same question in 2016. And as many of you may recall, 2016 was a time of even more uncertainty than there is now. And the reason for that is that we had two candidates, neither of whom had been president. That was the Clinton-Trump matchup. And they were two very disliked candidates, two of the most disliked candidates in American history. So there was a lot of apprehension if you recall, as to what the outcomes were going to be. And I did a survey with consumers the week after that election to ask exactly, kind of the question that we have now, which is what's going to happen to consumers. And back then, we had about 30% of people a bit panicked because they specifically said that due to the outcome of the election, they were planning on spending less. Now, what actually happened is on the next slide, which is nothing. We had record high spending for the holiday season in 2016. And this wasn't just e-commerce, which always has, which for the last several decades has outpaced all of retail. This is the NRF's overall retail numbers. So it was high, and it will likely be high again. This time we have two candidates who have both been president. So we know what the outcome is going to be. And business generally does okay regardless of the outcome of presidential elections. And no matter how chaotic you may think that it is going to be, there are countries that are far more chaotic. Brazil, India, Italy, their politics is as crazy, if not crazier, and their businesses do fine. So I'm not terribly worried about how the election is going to impact, kind of things like marketing spending or, kind of even consumer confidence. The other thing that actually does work with the later Thanksgiving is that gives a greater buffer between the November 5th election, if there is any short-term decline in spending, for it to kind of resume once the news cycle normalizes to that later Thanksgiving timeframe. Another thing that I would encourage everyone to just keep an eye on is Amazon's probably going to do another Prime version in October, as they've done for the last several years. Keep a very, very close eye on their sales numbers and what they release in press releases, because that's going to be the harbinger of how the rest of the holiday season does as well. Because if they have a softer Prime than they have had before, then that is something maybe to be worried about. But my hunch is that it will probably do very well because they've been trending pretty well to date.
The panel had some really diverse, interesting thoughts on this. And after this question, I'm going to start going over to some of the specific audience questions. And I'm being mindful of time. We have 12 minutes left. So we're going to start speeding it up here a bit. KK, you had some thoughts as to what all this means. I know you weren't thinking about this until I panicked you with it. So my apologies for throwing you into the pit of despair. But you've seemed to have climbed your way out. What are your thoughts about this whole consumer sentiment thing?
Yeah, I agree with Sucharita. So again, I think we already have the data, like historical data, which is very clear that like we are not going to see those declines. However, from a brand standpoint, like we just need to stay focused on solid contingency plans, like whether you have attractive promotions, like is your experience going to be seamless? I think as long as like we have those plans, I think it's all about preparation and then staying nimble during that time.
Jay, I think you would definitely agree with the advanced preparations. I think that was top of your mind as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Sucharita said as well. I think it's going to be a little anticlimactic, but regardless, these are macro impacts. And when you're in a 6 or 8 week crunch selling cycle, control what you can control. Be ready with your dials of price, promotion, product, variable marketing, order routing, same day delivery, BOPIS, all these things that you have at your disposal. Just practice being ready with those before you're in the situation. Practice for pivots that may happen. It could turn up or down, and then you need to pivot accordingly. So I'm a big fan of those intraday dials, having websites that give a lot of power to the end users, marketing that could make pivots during the day. I think the more dials you have and the more you can ready yourself in business in general, but certainly during peak, becomes the best recipe you can have to take advantage of whatever those macro impacts are.
All right, let's turn to some of the more specific questions and tactical questions. Scott, during the talk about the consumer sentiment, we actually had like a sub-conversation about consumers being more sensitive to sales moments, and they're still looking for discounts. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of following up on the last part that Sucharita showed, it's like there's two things in the world that I can guarantee. One is sky is blue, and the second is people are going to buy over holiday. And I think the way that we take advantage of it is you need to be promotional. We're day 2 into Amazon Prime Day. We're seeing some record-setting numbers. People are looking for discounts more than ever. So again, kind of saying that is like, you need to kind of think about what is your strategy? How are you going to be promotional? You also need to think about margins. I think that's where we're all being very conscious of it. That's what's keeping us all here employed. We're not just trying to slash prices left and right. We need to think about how are we strategic about it? How are we either increasing average order values? How are we getting kind of creative to get the most margin, but also the most effective way to acquire new customers, squeeze out more repeat revenue from existing customers, and kind of just make sure that this holiday is as big as we've always known holidays can be.
All right, let's turn to some audience questions here. Jesse Jackson has asked, how significant do you think the impact is of Temu on discount retailer performance in the US? For example, are they taking market share from US-based discount retailers? Sucharita, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that there have been some studies that Temu has hurt a lot of the dollar channel retailers. So that's absolutely kind of a sector that is likely challenged. But a significant part of the growth in e-commerce overall is coming from 4 players. It's Amazon, Walmart, Temu, and Shein. So, kind of, is it taking share? It may or may not be visible if you're growing as well, but they're definitely outpacing, kind of everybody else's growth. So there's not just a single player that's likely losing share. It is a variety of different players that, kind of, if you're not experiencing Temu's level of growth, you're losing share.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the panel before we move on? Going once, going twice?
I think, yeah, Temu, it's just perpetuating what I keep saying. Is like people right now are looking for deals. That's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. But again, you're not going to get those kind of like hallmark items that you're looking to put under the Christmas tree. You're not going to Temu to buy an Xbox that you're looking to get your kids. So it's like, you know what, you're going to go there for maybe more stocking stuffers, some more random items, but you're still going to have those major brands that you want to buy products from. Companies been looking at for a month to 6 months that you're preparing to buy and waiting for those big promotions. I think, again, it just is kind of like perpetuating this kind of idea that people are looking for a different discount or a different item. And it's just going to be another area of potential distraction for us. So it's like, how do we think about that and kind of play into it to kind of make sure that we're still staying front and center for the consumers we're really trying to capture.
All right.
What I will add is just quickly, there was a point about, kind of our election CPC is going to increase marketing costs. And I would actually argue probably Temu's ridiculous amount of spend that they've spent in marketing is what is distorting marketing costs. So just keep that in mind. And as long as they're there to kind of blow up the industry, it will probably be more of an adverse impact on average marketing costs than anything.
From Emily Bennett, quote, have you seen any research on GDP growth being driven by the top percentage of consumers versus the majority or average consumers? This would explain the gap versus consumer sentiment, which is probably more representative of the average consumer. So is there a growth being driven by the top percentage of consumers versus everybody? Sucharita, that might be
That's
more
always the case.
Yeah.
I mean, the top percentage of consumers are always the biggest spenders. But what's unusual is some of the data that Alan, you showed, which is that a lot of the negative sentiment is being distorted by a politicized environment. Some of it is just outright ignorance. There was a great Guardian, I believe, it was a Guardian and it was a co-study with somebody else, Harris Poll, where they said straight up that half of Americans think that it's the worst economy ever, which is not true. Like, it is like one of the best, I think that like a significant percent of people just didn't have the facts right. And, we're saying that it was like the worst unemployment rate ever when, kind of that's the opposite is true. So some of it is just, people just don't know what the facts are. And that's a large part of, I think, the consumer confidence. And that's not to say that there's not 8% of people that are suffering. Absolutely. There are certainly people that have to now resume their student loan payments, and there are people that kind of are maybe challenged by healthcare bills, and any number of factors that can influence a family's economic situation. But on average, kind of everybody is doing better, but they're just not saying that they are.
All right. So with 5 more minutes to go, I definitely want to get this one in. Rob, get ready to play it. Here's a question from Women in Retail's 2024 Top Woman of the Year, awarded at CommerceNext, by the way. She has a really good question for the panel. Rob, play that clip from Stephanie, please.
Hi, everyone. I have a quick question for the panel. I know that we've been watching TikTok continue to grow and bring in new customers over time, but recently was advertised by TikTok Business on my own TikTok feed saying 53% of TikTok users are turning to them this holiday to start their holiday planning, and 87% of TikTok users will be shopping gifts for themselves during the holiday season as well via TikTok. So just wondering how everyone is kind of evolving and figuring out this space. I know that the beauty segment specifically has already picked this up in a big way and have teams built out specifically for showing up here. And fashion is a little bit further behind, but working with creators to also show up in that TikTok shop space. So TikTok shop being an even bigger endeavor to take on as a brand. Just wondering how everyone's responding to that this season.
Great question. Who wants to take it?
I'll jump in. I mean, being in beauty, TikTok shops has been a big one for us. It's something that we've been leaning into. I think also from just consumer kind of like shopping behaviors, people are going more towards the explore pages on TikTok. So I think it's just kind of like having a presence and making sure you're there is just going to be ever more important. I think it's like, you want to be where your customers are and where your consumers are doing research, where they're looking for you and where they want to buy from you. And I think that's where, there's different categories that TikTok shops make sense for, some that it doesn't. I think there's a large margin percentage that TikTok shops is taking. So you got to really balance it out, weigh out the pros and cons to it. Is it something that you're willing to play into and kind of, is it work with your strategy? Or is it something, we want to be there. We're not really as concerned to drive sales from it, but we want to be there from an awareness standpoint. So I think there's a lot of strategies that different brands and different promotional strategies can take from it.
I'll jump in on if you're not using TikTok selling channels, which I actually don't have a lot of experience doing, but I do have experience doing more brand awareness and marketing on TikTok. And when you think about measuring your halo and measuring if you're using multi-touch attribution or whatever, I would make sure that you have really clean and agreeable data between the different parties in your company, marketing, finance, data, whoever. So you're measuring that accurately, because those after season learnings of the impact of TikTok on your other channels is super critical. But even more critical than that is having a data model that you can actually believe in and agree upon, because those things can skew wildly if you don't get it right up front.
All right. So last question here. Gonna try to get to some more of these customer audience questions. There's a question about shipping. This is from Ross Miller. Hey, Ross, thanks for joining us. How do you think the consumer is viewing things like higher free shipping thresholds? They concerned about it, not concerned about it? I mean, shipping obviously is going to be something that is on everyone's mind from a retailer standpoint.
Companies I've worked for, and even the ones that we serve, I did take the liberty of polling a few of them before coming on this webinar. The majority of the purchases, the AOVs at the companies I've worked for, the majority of the orders are already free shipping, whether that's because of loyalty or because of threshold. I think the decision matrix that these companies and will go through is when you start getting truncated closer towards the end, are you going to supplement priority shipping to help generate, depending on what your inventory position is, are you going to get more aggressive with expedited shipping to help churn through inventory?
And I'll just add, we typically do A/B test to determine what is the sweet spot, in terms of the threshold. And over the years, we have increased the threshold, as long as that increased threshold is not impacting your conversion rate too much, because you'll definitely you'll see an increase in your AOV. As long as that's not getting balanced out by a conversion decline, we should be good.
All right, I'm going to ask if everyone can just hang for 2 more minutes. There's a really interesting question here, and then we'll wrap up. Daniel Collins, he asks, with Canada expected to have the highest GDP growth out of the G7 nations in Q4 and well into 2025, what kind of work are you doing in finding service providers that can easily handle cross-border seamlessly? It's interesting. Maybe you make up some more of your holiday overseas. Any thoughts on this? Is overseas, outside of North America, outside of the U.S., is that a big play for anyone here?
I think cross-border. Go ahead if somebody wanted to go first on that.
I'll just throw in a quick one. I think it's just important to kind of look to the international markets. They're all watching us. I think they know that our big holiday seasons are big moments for them to buy. But then we also need to follow what theirs are. Boxing Day has become even bigger. I think even if you're looking back to 4th of July, like make sure you're kind of leaning into Canada Day and some of those. So I think it's definitely important to kind of keep top of mind if you have international strategies already in place.
And whether you're doing it directly, Canada certainly in the companies I've worked for was number 2 after the United States, and even out countries outside of that, there is opportunity there. The cross-border platforms out there that integrate with e-commerce platforms like ours enable you to really outsource the vast majority of the logistics behind that, because it can get kind of hairy in the cart. But Canada certainly leads the way as far as a secondary country in the businesses I've worked with.
Yeah, and we currently leverage Global E. And by that partnership, we ship to almost 175 countries from US. And Canada is one of the bigger international countries, like for our business. But yeah, there's a lot of like scalable.
Yeah, globally, ESW. There's 4 or 5 of them out there that dominate.
All righty. And with that, Sucharita, I'll give you the last word here. You want to comment on global shipping, or is there some giant nugget of wisdom you want to drop upon us that will guide us?
Give us
give us the big one. Go for it.
Just do it.
Just do it.
Just do it. Just get out there and focus on the customers, I think is what you told me in one of the prep calls. Stop complaining. Get focused on your customers. All righty. Well, folks, speakers, thank you very much. Sucharita, thank you so much for taking all that time to prepare that research for us. Jay, thank you to Fabric for sponsoring this. Scott and KK, thanks again for taking all of your time. We had a bunch of prep calls on this. Very helpful. Audience, thank you. Great questions. Couldn't do this without you. And with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks. I hope everyone has a great remainder of the week and a fabulous weekend. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.